acompañarnos en el evento de lanzamiento del proyecto Informalidad en los tiempos de
Good morning to all. Thank you very much for coming to this meeting about the COVID impact on those communities who are least favored.
I would like to express our gratitude to our sponsors and partners. First, the University of Kent, the University of Essex, the University of Warwick. Also to the Observatory of Women's Equity at ICESI University in Cali, the Labor Observatory of Rosario University, and the research group on public health and epidemiology at the Universidad del Rosario, and Alianza EFI. I also would like to thank all our speakers and participants for joining us this afternoon. I'll come back to Spanish. La agenda de este evento.
The agenda for today would be as follows. First, we will have the welcoming words of the Vice Dean of our faculty, Dr. Laura Victoria Garcia Matamoros, and then we will continue with Luis Eslavas about the research project, the research team, and the conclusions and the presentation of the project. We will continue with Joana Cortez, which actually will present the research results, and then we will have the Angelica Sierras' participation, who will tell us a bit what was the activity with those members of the research, and we will have the intervention of Italo Cardona, who's a representative of the World Labor Organization, WHO, and then we have Ingi Mans about the guiding principles of human rights and companies in the United Nations in the informal economy, and then we will have the presentation of Celine Tan, who will speak about informality within the global economic order and the legal order, and we will conclude with the presentation agenda with a documentary of 15 minutes prepared by the Colectivo Arto Arte. And we will have at the end of the presentation of the documentary a venue of 10 minutes for questions and answers. Without further ado, we will welcome you about Laura Victoria Matamoros, the Vice Dean of Jurisprudence, a faculty member of this faculty and an expert in international law. Vice Dean, please, if you may. Good morning and afternoon and evening, depending on the hour. Thank you very much to Enrique Prieto and Joana Cortez for inviting me to this venue to greet in a gathering that unequivocally is of the utmost importance for jurisprudence faculty, in the sense that it tackles an issue that is of great concern and of great pertinence, which is that of informality in the times of COVID. I think that it's a problem that this international impact that gathers us as human beings, it's not a problem only of our country, but rather world. I want to thank Enrique Prieto to greet the Kent, Essex, and Warwick University and the ICESI University in Cali for their participation with the Observatory Equity of Among Women, the Rosario team, research team, the Public Health and Epidemiology of the Rosario University, and the alliance with the EFI. Of course, a special greeting to the guest speakers, to Professor Luis Eslava, Joana Cortez, Don Italo Cardona, and Miss Luzmeri Pardo, that apparently she cannot be with us because she had a last-minute problem with her hardware. But she will have in her representation Angelica Sierra, Celine Diane, Dimas. I think that the excellence of the team that we have gotten with their expertise that have been contributed is an assurance factor for the success of this meeting, for this gathering. And it's very important that behind this project, we have a multidisciplinary team that is great, that has enabled us to have results that very probably are going to be very, very valuable. I would like to mention certain aspects that are very important in terms of the development of this project about informality of the times of COVID. And it starts from an initiative of Ruptures21, which are within the International Economic Law Collective, that was arranged with a group of members of academia from a critical standpoint of economic laws and social, economic, and political, geopolitical, and historic of this area of law. So for us, it is a look outside of orthodox academy that has focused or centered us in the axis of the studies of the international law. As we see, the focus of the problem that we're going to treat has another characteristic, and that is very important in the research of these type of problem, which is needing multidisciplinary skill sets. So you need to gather a group of members of academia, economists, social workers, anthropologists, movie makers, graphic designers, web page designers, people accountable for public policy, an entire array of very interesting, very diverse specialties that sit and study a common problem, the problem of pandemia, amongst informal workers and in those economies that are being used, and using that Colombian case that unequivocally it's a case that, let's just say, that is quite illustrative what informality is in terms of employment and the effects of this pandemic in this job sector. And this multidisciplinary set of skills brings a whole array of products. We don't have the traditional deliverables that are typical of academia. It will come out in different languages to be able to highlight life experiences, life histories that are not really studied there, not from only the theoretical aspect, but actually the life of those people that live in an informal way in the economy. I mean, as a whole, the entire topic of artistic development and of other developments that are also very important. It's also worthwhile to highlight the alliances that are generated from this project that are very valuable. And here I speak about the perspective of the Faculty of Jurisprudence in the Rosario University that I celebrate this development of this project, all the alliances that are generated with universities, with the real sector, with the very groups of the university with which we expect with all of you. We wanted to develop new initiatives in topics of common interest. The internationalization that I mentioned at the beginning of this is quite clear. It's important that this experience enables us to continue to articulate the multidisciplinary international work. And from this experience, we can begin to structure new projects with greater scopes, not only in Colombia, but perhaps we can reach other countries. With these brief guidelines that I wanted to point out, I would like to close by stating that we're more than assured that this will be an enriching venue, a valuable one to bring new contributions to this project. Very probably it will invite us to think of the future in terms of academic debates that warrant an international perspective and a multidisciplinary perspective. Thanks again to all of the members present here. And please be informed that this faculty will always have an open door policy for any initiative of this type. A warm hug and greetings to all. Thank you very much, Vice Dean. And it's very nice to hear this message to continue to strengthen academic ties with all of our partners in the UK and with all those social groups in Colombia, and to continue to try to find an approach to solve these problems. After this, in the next item on the agenda, after the welcome is Luis Eslava's intervention, who will speak about his research project, and he will also comment about the research team, what are the deliverables that derive from this. Mr. Slava is international law professor, and he's a critical study of international law of Kent University. And he was the coordinator, or is the coordinator of this project. Professor Slava, please, if you may.
Muchas gracias a Enrique, muchas gracias, vicedecana, por
Thank you very much, Enrique. Thank you, Vice Dean, for the presentation and the introduction. Thank you very much to all the colleagues who have participated in this research for their work, for all the support, all those institutions, Rosario University, Kent University, Essex University, and Warwick University, and the FE contributors, the Observatory for Equalness or Equity Among Women, and our internal allies within the Rosario University, the Faculty of Jurisprudence, and the studies of public health as well of Rosario University. I am going to let you know quickly in respect of some of the reasons and some of the sources that actually organized this project, and then I would let you know what are the premises that we had set in this research for the past few months, and then we will speak for a second about the staff of the working team, and then the partial conclusions that we've managed to have and how that becomes a feedback input so that we can have a sort of package in the next week. The entry point is this little rascal that has been arriving to order the new world order completely. When the virus begins to expand and crosses the Chinese borders and gets to Europe, with my colleagues in the University of Kent, our professor becomes there of the IEL collective, we begin to ask ourselves how what we have been discussing for so many years in respect of the international economic order, about society, about communities, about the grassroots groups, was going to develop during this context of what we are beginning to call it the pandemia. So what we decided to do is to activate this IEL collective that you have heard so much there in this event, the IEL collective, members of academia that work in international economic law and understanding that not as a discrete area of juridical thought, but rather as a venue to understand the economic world order and how it operates through law. And now they end up giving it a particular shape and ends up the social, impacting social activities throughout the globe. And the first thing we realized in these conversations that we had was that the future, and here I am speaking of March, April, the future began to seem quite bleak with the virus, and it was going to accentuate problems that we already saw them clear at that time. And it was confirmed by CEPAL and the International Monetary Fund that they already said that in the Latin American context, the GDP, the regional GDP, was going to fall about 5.3%. And that forecast that it was quite bleak, it actually has become even worse in the past few months. The International Monetary Funds and the World Bank are now speaking of a contraction of minus 7.2 or minus 9.4% respectively. And this is part of a report that it's called the Latin American Consensus for 2020. And it's a response to say, we need to go beyond the consensus of Washington of the 90s. And now it's to have to issue a report that is endorsed by those economic thinkers and the most important regional economic thinkers regionally, and those from Spain. The IEL collective began to think in respect of where we can act, and they have lost the states have lost capacity to provide services and well-being to their citizens. The OECD mentioned that in Colombia you need 300 years 11 generations to bring them out of poverty. Now, this diagnosis, initial diagnosis or snapshot that we had in respect of the main threats to poverty reduction, we actually began to see it by the beginning of October. The World Bank came here to tell us that we expected that more or less 115 million people were going to fall back into poverty in the year 23. They were going to get to extreme poverty. It means that it would wipe out all progress that we had in terms of the reduction of extreme poverty. So with this in mind, we here in England, from the IEL collective and our counterparts in Colombia, decided to carry on a study with Mr. Enrique Prieto to see what can we do to answer to these realities. So in collaboration with Johanna and Enrique, we invited Ivan Daniel, our expert in labor law, and Leonardo Briceño, an expert in public policy, so that we can discuss what kind of study project we can have. And very quickly, Leonardo, and I will also thank Leonardo, Leonardo drew our attention amongst many of the things that we were seeing at the beginning of the pandemic. Speaking of the Latin American context, how the virus was going to evolve and to which sectors it's going to. Leonardo drew our attention to the fact that the ambulance driver that were going to play a very important role were going to be very difficult of having to pick up informal workers. And there we realized that this problem that was being mentioned by Leonardo in the Colombian context was going to be a global problem in terms of the volume and the magnitude of these problems. In 2019, a year ago, the OECD stated jointly with the World Labor Organization, WHO, said that 61% live off informal economies. So you need an interdisciplinary, interinstitutional, and international, so it becomes relevant. And we created an internal group within the IEL that we called it Ruptures21, which is towards new economies, societies, and legalities, so that we can actually face with the crisis publicly and with the pandemia and how this impacts our informal workers, and taking Colombia as a reference group. This is the group that we have actually did it. Some 20 members of academia, social and juridical anthropologists, and labor ones, graphic designers, audiovisual artists, and an entire set of alliances and institutions that come to provide support in the past few months. Quickly, what were the premises, the initial premises that gradually they have become the central pillars of our intervention? We're going to begin to share here. Then we have here, the first thing is that we have there that informality is the norm and formality the exception. So in a context like Colombia, and then we have the second one here is the importance here of the enormous contribution of the informal economy does to the rest of the well-being of society. The third pillar is how this enormous contribution that informal economy provides to the general economy, however, in terms of GDP, is actually crossed a whole array of things that are very fragile, that they're not very stable. And finally, and thanks to this informality or great volume of informality, which is the norm, it's not the exception, the enormous contribution that these informal workers do, and then they actually have turned into other fragile systems in order to begin to understand what is the relationship between informality and formal economy for the economy to work. This is data that actually has come out from this research and actually illustrates the importance of these four pillars. For example, we have this, and we have not, Now we have realized through our quantitative exercise that 61.2% of the workers actually work in informal economy. When we use it as a way, the no contribution to the pension system and to the health system, which is not very far away from the global levels, as you actually realized, which was the OECD and the International Organization of Labor, that at the global level, 61% of the workers are not covered. Now we have a low informality in 54.5 in the urban sectors, but actually goes to 85.7 in the rural sectors. Okay, so now 61.2 of the informal workers in Colombia. In terms of volume, they actually reached some 14 million citizens, and these are the ones that actually sustain some 6.6 million homes. Now, this great contribution in terms of well-being and caring and productivity that the informal economy does to the general economy actually do not have uh, adequate income. 76% of informal workers earn less than $10 a day, which is what they need to live a dignified, it is what you need to live dignified there. And 16 or 17% of them actually earn less than $1.90, which is the poverty line, which is extreme poverty. So in terms of products, and what have we managed to achieve, that we're going to be able to share with the public here at a database that is aggregated, which is the most possible in Colombia in terms of the economy as well as the informal workers. And three reports, five live histories, one documentary that we're going to share with you in a second, a digital platform where we actually are able to share permanently all these products and all of this. And this is very important. This has been one of our commitments from the very beginning. Everything in Spanish and English. So in the past few days, if you followed us in Twitter, we have been able to share our first report and our live history, both in Spanish and in English. I want to close with this uh, caricature that was shared with a critical artist that was actually drawing our attention in respect of the situation that many informal workers today are having to face due to pandemia, and how pandemia actually has turned their precarious situation in ultra precarious condition. It is our job as members of academia and the social groups at the Colombian level, at the regional level, at the international level, to try to fight this marginalness ever more of the groups that are so important of the population, and we have to try to revert what they do in the economy is productivity as well as contributions. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Luis Eslava. Simply to remind you that in Twitter, you can always find the IEL collective as at ruptures underscore 21 or ruptures is, and there you have all the information that Professor Slava has shared. You can find it also. Thank you very much, Professor Slava. Now we're going to step to Joana Cortez Nieta, who will now speak about the research result. She's a professor of jurisprudence at Rosario University, and she is the academic director and administrative director of this project. So Joanna, please. Right, thank you very much. I'm going to put here my timer here. Thank you. Thank you very much for being with us in this gathering of presenting the initial results of this project. And once again, to all the marvelous multidisciplinary team that we had in there, researchers from the quantitative aspect, the qualitative aspect, the designers, the translators. It was all, there were marvelous assistants there. Thank you. Thank you very much. Truly, for accompanying us in this project. I would like to concentrate myself in certain points associated with the proposals or suggestions of public policy that have actually come out as of the quantitative and qualitative operation that we have carried out for more than 6 months. The first point on which I wish to concentrate is the need to reformulate social policy, social security, and regulating labor in the country. This we have already said it in the media and other very. COVID has accentuated inequities and has impacted negatively social policies and protections in many countries, and in Colombia, of course. All of these precarious conditions that they were in, they have actually brought them to ultra precarious conditions. Begin to think in which other ways can we rethink of social policy, social security, and labor regulation for informal workers now. Social policies must recognize the enormous contributions that informal workers do to the economy of the nation. Not only, as Luis mentioned, the informal work is the main source of employment in the country, but actually their contribution, not terms in taxing, but actually in their value chain is enormous. Regrettably, it is not duly quantified, but there are some studies that we in part actually try to do a contribution in this sense, and we try to do this enormous contribution. And the fair thing is that the social policies also recognize and face from this great contribution that the workers do informally. In this sense, one of the first questions that we have is that we must reevaluate is that actually is not only extreme poverty or the formal work that are the only ways to actually come into social security and social policy. Many workers, informal workers, as we showed, some are below the poverty line and they actually can have access to various public subsidies, but there's another ones that are not there. They're made invisible by the social security system, and a serious problem like the pandemic that we're having to face. These are going to the streets to work without any type of social or labor protection. So it's important to rethink these channels of insources to social policies, and we also are trying to support many of the proposals that actually have a universal protection measures and the basic income for all and pensions for all. And then we propose things as the solidarity salary that in shock areas like this at present that informal workers will have at the end of the day some cushion to fall back on so they can overcome issues like the pandemic. And finally, I think it's very important really for the regulation of social security as well as labor issues to rethink this dichotomy of formality and informality. Formal workers are formal workers and they have the right to the guarantees of social security, of work in dignified conditions. So we need actually to get away from that scheme and actually to have a protection scheme for their work. The second point that we consider that is important is the importance of data. The first part of the research was to build from secondary information, and then we realized that actually informal workers at the end of the day are invisible from many of these official statistics. And also the data that there exists, it doesn't allow us to identify the complexity and the diversity that there is amongst informal workers. So it's important to strengthen the information systems and also to recognize, and I think that here we are going to go more in depth here, and we're going to past the dichotomy of informality and formality to begin to think of informality and formality of the different economies that there are within informal work. And there we see some challenges. For example, we see a lot of informal workers do not want to give any of their information because they follow them, many of their statistics, and there's actually are scored in formality and formality. And if they become formal, they would lose them or to be qualified as illegal workers. And so they have sanctuary there, and not only that, they become marginalized and punished by the legal system, so to speak. Also, we think there that it's important for us to move towards systems of self-identification and to use the data, the figures to be able to understand and to have policies that are far more effective and actually recognize the contribution. And there it's important here, and we pointed out certain venues to quantify the contribution workers do to the value chains. And now to close, one of the point that I think that is cross the board for all suggestions of public policies is to recognize the relationship between informality, gender, and care. Although it's true that women are less represented in formal jobs, we need to recognize this within the structures of inequities for women and in the labor sector. Also, we need to understand that The informal workers offers many opportunities, a strategy that at the end is unfair for women because they are in charge of rearing children, caring for the family, and there we have a space for the responsibilities, and it's a venue where they're unprotected and ends up marginalized and making them more vulnerable. So now we have the ones here of activities of care. And we have had now, in view of the valuation that we have, it's actually brought us to a stigma of the workers that actually perform informal workers, and that has led them so that the work informally becomes a scenario of greater exploitation of women. I am out of time. I would love to tell you all the other stuff that I have of public policies, but I invite you that you query the reports, and they are already in circulation. And then the other two ones that are with the live study that are in the social networks, and they're in the page of the event. Thank you very much, Joanna. And I want to clarify with the participants that they can continue with the collective of IEL. The account is at IEL underscore collective with double L and E at the end. There you can find all the information of the collective. So with that, thank you very much. And closing with Johanna intervention, we are now going to go to the intervention of Professor Angelica Sierra, who was a research member. She's a psychologist from the National University, and she's a member of the research group of social economy of this group. And Angelica, please, if you could proceed. Thank you. Right, very good morning to all. Thank you very much for being here at this gathering or meeting as the coordinator of the qualitative exercise that we carried out with the different life stories that we analyzed throughout this conversation that we're having between the technical discussion and the direct experience of people that live informally. I would like to leave some teachings and some open conversations that are left for later, and especially now to open the debate that now more than ever it's more necessary. First of all, clearly what we have done is that this definition of informality is actually undermining all the diversity and all the contributions and the debt that we have, the popular sector. And I don't want to make this an, a history of all the debt that we have this. No, that we have to have to put people a multiple expression of popular economies and call them informal. It doesn't allow you to view the differences, and that's why public policy many a times is not so well accepted. For this exercise, what we did mostly was in telephone interviews, clearly preserving all the care and self-care of the research team, but also we did some visits for the documentary. And I wanted to point out some key points of the experiences that we had very kindly with the team. And then first that of Luz Mary, that she was not with us because of some hardware issues, but she points out a feeling and an experience of a profound abandonment by government institutions and district institutions to the sexual workers and to the street workers and people who live in the streets that regrettably are in very precarious situations in terms of housing and also by having their daily income. And with that, we point out that these economies are economies that many a time actually have to do with the resources that they get by the day. And that's how they have their survival. So by limiting uh, having to leave their homes if they can't go on the street, their affectation was impacted immediately. And it's not to say that the people in these people would have the option to walk the streets. No, but rather it's actually the care of those government institutions should have been more pointed, more quick, and more decisive in respect of people that live day to day, day by day. She's a recycler, and she pointed out how the change in the development of their commercial activities meant that for recyclers that they were always able to go to the street to work, but without much protection or much care of this type of situations to guarantee the care of these peoples. And they're saying that they diminish the collection of material due to the fact that commercial malls and other places actually had a lot trash, and they had to develop a family strategies to have the minimum vital there of those recyclers. So, well, Patricia, who is a street salesperson, to have a strategy to obtain their resources with her partner, showed us how the carelessness of financial institutions in respect of the debt that meant the entire reform in their work life, and this due to the fact that they couldn't go out to work, etc. Debts kept on building up. And another element that was very important that she pointed out was how it impacted seriously the increase of public utilities. And not in the sense that they don't have money, they don't have income, they need now more public services like water, public utilities like water, like electricity, like internet, and like telephone communications to talk with their loved ones. Lastly, Jose, which is the one that I wanted to mention perhaps the most, he highlights the same there, the absolute precariousness that migrant workers have to face, and they have to work having access to different ways to the work through apps in home deliveries. This just to actually account for how we need to do an interaction between reflection, theoretically, technically, and the life that they had to do there. They're very kindly. They would service us, they would do that, and they actually pose some question and they would give to these teachings. Right. So now, in closing in a minute, is what is all of this that's happening? And this is what we were saying by Joanna and Luis, is that the crisis situation has evidence to a greater degree the more in depth of the inequities that we have. And these inequities, as a matter of fact, in the measure, the ones that have the most income, they have formal employment. Can they guarantee the reproduction of life and the care of their home? But what happens with all those people that in many cases are destined irrevocably to this which is called informality, is that these are people that if they were not able to have access to credit within the loan sharks, and that is another discussion altogether. But they couldn't give that. They couldn't have a traditional saving lines, a fund of neighborhood savings and so on. The recession was just brutal, and everything was denied. All their entire capacity of being able to work in the day in day out life. So this call that is done by the feminist economy, it becomes ever more relevant and is put at the heart of the economic decisions, the reproduction of life, the supply, the need to guarantee a production that is fair and adequate in the cities, that with that we'd actually have farm communities, their situations that are also very precarious, that are so dear where they are now. So this means now that it's time to value the importance of these informal economies, and I think that that's a bad name that now become central in the reproduction of life. These city workers are the ones who have actually gone to the farmers to be able to bring the food when the main market was closed. It is the environmental recyclers who actually do the recycling work, but it's quite precarious, and not to speak of the other activities that have a great relevance for the production of life, which is the caring of children or the caring of homes and the like. I think that that's what I wanted to share, Jerusalem. I hope I have not breached the dictator of the clock. Thank you very much, Angelica, for your invention that is so relevant, and to present these live stories that will be in the report that very soon we will share with Andres in our webpage. And next, we have the intervention of the representative of the WLO in Colombia, and Italo Cardona. Thank you very much for being with us today in this launch, and the mic is all yours, sirs. Right. good morning for Colombian time, for at least in this latitude in Bogota. Thank you very much for the invitation to be able to share some thoughts to what we have already heard today, and that we have actually pursued to look at this project, this process that we have been working, that I greet and I congratulate, that enables me in one way to give a look from different sectors and different optics to the same reality. That one way it enables us to begin to create not only the awareness, but actually to find the necessary answers to be able to face and promote this transition from informality that is so needed in our countries and in Latin America, of course, but it is so necessary in Colombia. Quickly, because I know that the intervention time is short, there are certain topics that I wish to mention, and I want to do reiterate, and I've said before, is first, although the pandemic has shown us and has made evident certain variables that affects the crisis in the labor organization, we have to recognize that before that, we had in a crisis, it's just that the pandemic has just amplified with an amplifying glass for us to look of all these things that we were arguing that they were far away from that reality or denying reality that we were in a crisis. So now it's just absolutely evident. We have to recognize that the Latin American ones, that such a high rate of informality was in a situation of informality that meant some challenges and still means challenges way before pandemic. And now we're seeing and we're doing some reflections as to what do we need to rebuild, how should the response be from the institutions and the public institution, but always the participation of the organization of workers and the same academia to build and to respond better, and not only to be at 1 minute before we are the pandemic and so on, but rather we can effectively do and actually look for the responses to the things that were already occurring in the year 2019. Actually, the title that we were using for another proposal, but I want to draw your attention in respect of the rate of informality that had already been recognized for 2019, that was close to six of out of 10 workers, they were really informal people, and we were hearing that as one, and they were introduced there in a very clear and direct manner. And this is one of those things that had already been presented to us in a very clear and direct manner, and that is that informality is not one type of informality. It cannot be characterized in the same way, and we're going to speak in a minute, in a few slides and so on, but it doesn't affect everyone just the same way. And that is important so that you know how to intervene in respect of facing the crises and the work crisis, where the impact has been differentiated depending on the issue. First, on how you were before the work in the labor market. I mean, if you had a person that was in informality before the crisis, well, of course, that is one of the sectors where we have received more vulnerability. And when you had one of those, the level of inequality was actually broadened even further now. And the second element, of course, there are certain sectors where the pandemic, in the restrictions of mobility, has affected even more directly these indicators that are more direct. Now we have to recognize that this effect that has been generated through the crisis and through the months during this year actually has created some new phases. Because what would be the new phase of the most affected population through this situation of informality, also the loss of employment or the precarious type of employment. So fundamentally, this has been a crisis that actually affected the young population, and within the youngsters, we have a lot of women. If we want to put an effective face to this, we can actually identify not only one, but actually the most evident ones are the ones that show here the face of a young woman that actually has received and has to face the crisis in a more direct manner. And simply, I just wish to remember certain mentioned that CEPAL, UNICEF, the World Labor Organization has mentioned there's of the effects of the impact that we have of increasing the poverty levels and the educational levels of women, the impact that we have in society as such, that is going to have in society as a whole effectively is going to be greater, and we have to keep that in mind. Of course, there are certain sectors that are of a very important vulnerabilities. One of those access gap to the labor market and to the fact that these are the migrant workers. These migrant workers, as one, these were in this precarious situation in the labor market, and now they have seen this situation now increases as a function of the pandemic. So two words to just say something about what does the WALO proposes. It proposes certain points that we consider important that enable us to tackle informality, that enables us to face this situation of what is happening, and that somehow or the other, the call is then to find that we find how effectively we can answer effectively through a policy of employment as the agreement of 192 it calls that it actually helps us there to write about a policy to a set of ones there that you have there, and then we have some elements that are going to query there and so on. Then we have there the different proposals, and then we have there before the pandemic, and then of course in this context that enables us to give an orientation to the answer that is multidisciplinary, and then we have to do it there, and then we have there, and then we have there, and now we have the ones that we have the existence there, and then some norms that actually can have a social dialogue that then we have there, and for the strengthening of these mechanisms of supervision that enables us to get to some sectors that particularly have been affected by that. We believe that we should give a priority response, and all the efforts and all the work that we're doing and that is progressing by the different studies as one, and of course by the academia, they all contribute to have this dialogue, this awareness, and of course to innovate in the way we're going to service this situation that enables us not only to answer to the current needs, but actually to answer better, to reconstruct and to promote the decent work, the sustainable development, and not leave anyone behind in the development. Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much, Professor Angelo Cardona, to share with us all the activities, all this information, and of course, this valuable activity that the WLO pursues in Colombia.
Okay, so with this in mind, we will continue with the next part of this event. And then we've got the intervention by Dr. Anil Yilmaz, who will talk about international frameworks and the informal economy, pending talks. Dr. Anil Yilmaz, she's a lecturer in law and co-director at the Essex Business and Human Rights Project. And she's also a member of the research and academic committee of this project. So Anil, please, the microphone is all yours.
Okay, thank you, Enrique. Thank you, everyone. It was very interesting to listen to all the presentations. And I'm sorry I can't speak Spanish, so I'll do this in English. I would like to start by thanking the research team and the participants who actually shared their life stories and experiences with the research team. And that was quite valuable for this research. My comments will focus on the relationship between international and domestic frameworks addressing businesses' responsibilities in the area of human rights and labor protection. And I will look at to what extent they might or might not be capturing informal work arrangements. Now, the findings of this research provide a lot of food for thought for me, but also for scholars and policymakers, I think, and civil society organizations working in the area of business and human rights. The research does show us the connectedness of the informal and formal economies and the relationship of the informal work to the global value chains. And so, you know, many brands at the top of supply chains that sell their goods might be benefiting from informal employment indirectly, and in a way exploitation of informal work. So what I also noticed is that policies at international and national levels present informal employment as a major challenge for economies and as a problem that needs urgent attention. And what we see in national policies is generally a punitive approach to informality. And even some international policies kind of aim to eradicate informal work through stronger enforcement of labor standards and bringing workers and integrating them into the formal economy. And some of the presentations today demonstrated that. But this research did show that the issue of informality and formality isn't black and white, and transition to formality from informality is not always possible or desirable or straightforward without putting workers at greater vulnerability. If a worker is an irregular migrant or has caring responsibilities, they might it might be more flexible for them to be in informal employment, and being pushed to formal employment or formal structures of employment might actually put them at greater risk. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't strive for everyone having access to decent work and ideally maybe formal work, but I think it's important to stop looking at this as a dichotomy between informality and formality. And what we see is also a top-down approach by policymakers. So the objective seems to be that we need to transition informal workers into formal employment. What this project shows, the findings of this project, is that rather than exclusively focusing on formalizing workers top-down, in the short and medium term at least, there should be a greater focus on the recognition and fulfillment of informal workers' right to work and right to decent work, as well as their access to social protection, regardless of whether they are informal or formal workers. Now, we know that states have duties under international human rights law, international labor law, and what I'd like to quite quickly comment on for the rest of my time is business responsibilities in the area of human rights. As I said at the beginning, informal economy is intrinsically connected to global value chains. And the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights is the most authoritative non-binding instrument setting principles in this area, and it recognizes business responsibilities in the area of human rights and requires businesses to take steps to prevent, avoid, mitigate human rights impacts, both within their own operations, but also within their broader supply chains. And beyond, so this goes beyond the duties of states in the area of human rights and labor rights. And one of the ways through which businesses are expected to do this is to carry out human rights due diligence, and this should include their entire value chain, ideally. Now, while the UN Guiding Principles do refer to international human rights instruments, to the two covenants on to the two UN covenants, one on economic, social, and cultural rights, and one on civil and political rights, as well as referring directly to the ILO Declaration on Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work, it's often unclear to those working in this area to what extent businesses should be attempting to bring informal workers into the formal structures of work in their supply chain. And we've seen this in the context of the pandemic, but we've seen this also before that, where, for instance, in garment factories in various parts of the world outsource manufacturing of garments to informal home workers. And we know that the pandemic made the situation worse because brands were not paying the monies that they owe to factories. And so what happens is that often in the human rights due diligence processes where this is done by businesses, they might focus on the first tier of their supply chain. And this often misses the informal workers that may be beyond the first tier of supply chain. So what I would just say to conclude is that it's important that in the context of policymaking in this area of business and human rights due diligence processes, including consultation with affected groups, should not neglect informal workers. And rather than exclusively focusing on formalization in this process, there should be support for decent work conditions and protect right to work, rather than accentuating the vulnerabilities of informal workers, especially in times like this, where we're going through a major health crisis globally. I'll conclude it here. I think I've run out of time. Thank you.
Thank you, Anil, and very important your comment, and is relevant to take into account that last week the projective and international binding treaties on business and human rights that they're supposed to be negotiations at Geneva, and it just collapsed. It failed. However, the treaty itself did not confront the issue of informality. So again, within the business and human rights context, there's a lot of things to learn in terms of informality. Thank you so much, Anil. So without any further ado, so then we will move to the next part of this presentation that is in charge of Dr. Celine Tan. Dr. Celine Tan will talk about informality and the global economic and legal order. She's a reader in law and co-director at the Center for Law, Regulation, and Governance of the Global Economy, known as GLOBE, at University of Warwick. And she's also a member of the research and academic committee of this project. So Celine, welcome. Thank you so much, Anil and Celine, for joining us. It's quite late in England, so the microphone is all yours.
Thank you very much, Enrique. It's always really difficult to be the last speaker of a very exciting event, because everybody else has said what you've already planned to say. I just wanted to say thank you to the project team, everybody at Rosario, for having this conceiving of this amazing project and involving us at Warwick Law School in this really exciting project with colleagues from Kent and Essex as well. I've been kind of tasked to talk a little bit about how the project relates to the global economy and the international economic architecture as a whole. And I think what's really important to remember is that when we look at the specific case study of Colombia in relation to informality, informal work, and the impact of the pandemic, is that we must locate that particular circumstance and the particular case within the broader global economic structures and the framework of global economic governance and international economic law into which Colombia as a state is embedded into. So you can't really disembed the policies which the Colombian government and local governments and communities and the private sector within Colombia are making with regards to the labor market from the policies that the Colombia state has to adhere to in response to the pressures brought to bear by the external institutions and processes of international economic law. So you can see that the structures of the Colombian economy, some of them, that Anil and Luis also raised, and Joanna, it's been a consequence of, the kind of structures of the contemporary global economy that Colombia in itself and lots of developing countries are really embedded in, highly dependent on external finance and investment, and highly dependent on the policies and procedures and laws and normative constraints that are being made by institutions and processes that are outside not just the state of Colombia, but also the communities which have to live by them. And you can see in terms of the high levels of informality across the globe, and the tensions then arise with how states in the global south are dealing with the pandemic. Is very much also constrained by the kind of policies of austerity that have been imposed by the international financial institutions through lending agreements over not just now, but also over decades, and that in itself is also a symptom of the kind of embeddedness of the global south in terms of a broader extractivist economy that sees a lot of southern countries being sort of the I suppose the resource suppliers for global supply chains that are controlled by the North. And all these things leave very little room for maneuver in terms of governments in the global South, and in Colombia in particular, in determining how governments can and should respond to the impact of crises, whether it's financial, health, climate related, or economic. And so that's sort of things that I wanted to kind of like, I suppose bring to the table here, is that we cannot disembed, the policies and the practices and also the impact of Colombian, I suppose, policies on informal workers. Disembed them from the structures of the global economy. And I think in this respect, this brings us to what the contributions of this project is, and why, to square, so round off, complete the circle that Luis started at the beginning of the event in outlining our project. In a way, this project represents what we at the IEL Collective want to do in terms of challenging the structures of the global economy and the institutions and the processes of the global economy that have these very, very key, clear, deep, and tangible impacts on communities in the global South through this embeddedness within this global economy. And I think this project does it in two ways, in terms of diversifying, pluralizing the scholarship and the policy and the practices of international economic law. And it does it in two ways. Firstly, substantively, because in order to change structures that are problematic, that we are embedded into as people from the global South and communities in the global South, we've got to have evidence of how policies may or may not be working, and what the tensions are and the bottlenecks are and the contradictions are between local policies and those that are externally imposed. So in this first contribution, I think the project seeks to find out this empirical evidence, to collate the data that is necessary to then demonstrate, for purposes of policy making, for changing structures, for having those conversations in the realm of policy, in the realm of practice, in the realm of scholarship on international economic law. That's what this particular project does. And secondly, I think methodologically, we at as a project team want to make that contribution as well, that you cannot consider aspects of international law and aspects of law and the global economy and international economic law, such as trade, investment, financial regulation, wholly from a legalistic or doctrinal jurisprudential perspective, because that doesn't get you anywhere in terms of actually changing systems for the benefit of communities. What you need to do is actually to take a very interdisciplinary look at it, to collate data in a way that perhaps legal scholars and legal practitioners don't normally do, which is actually to look at impact of norms on the ground, right, and how it operates. And so hopefully we're also trying to make that methodological contribution through this interdisciplinary work that our excellent interdisciplinary team in Rosario have been doing through anthropology, social science, sociology, medical, health, epidemiologists. And so bringing in these different perspectives gives us that really holistic view of how, structures of the pandemic, systemic issues of the pandemic is affecting very tangible, real case studies on the ground. And I think, it contributes to that richness of that discipline, and hopefully will improve policy making at the national and the global level. So I think this is, I'm running out of time, so just going to say really that, this has been an amazing project to work with, because I think it just represents what we as a collective of, plural, diverse, critical scholars and practitioners on international economic law seek to do through the collective and through our networks and through partnerships with people and scholars and communities in the global south, and also making those the outcomes of our research and our project much more tangible through different medium of documentaries and life histories and arts. And it's just, we hope that this will make such a contribution and be our part of a catalyst for a longer term and more sustained conversation about the impacts of COVID on informality, but on the nature of informality itself and its relationship to global structures of economic governance and international economic law. I'm going to stop there now, and do follow us on Twitter, Ruptures21 and the IEL Collective, and also have a look at our website. That's me done.
Thank you so much, Celine, and thank you for your intervention. Very important, giving us the opportunity to understand how this project works within this structure of international economic law and all those economic forces around the world. So thank you so much, Celine, for this intervention and for your support for this project, and also, of course, Warwick's support. Okay, so I'll switch to Spanish. Bueno, muchísimas gracias.
Right, so thank you very much. And now we're in the last phase of this meeting, which would be to present the documentary, which is called Informality in the COVID Times, that was produced by Artobarte Collective. Thank you very much to the...
Sindicatos, estudiantes, ambientalistas, indígenas, organizaciones campesinas salieron a la calle libremente a expresar su desacuerdo con la forma que como el gobierno del presidente Duque está llevando el país.
Aplicaremos un aislamiento preventivo obligatorio para todos los colombianos.
Volvieron los homicidios colectivos en el gobierno del presidente Duque. Eso no corresponde a la realidad.
Porque está Oiga, vea, patilla, patilla, a mí ya 1500, a mí ya 1500. Delicioso salpicón, vea, delicioso mandarinazo.
El entendimiento de la informalidad ha sido y continúa siendo que es un problema para la economía de los países y que la mejor forma de solucionarlo es trayendo a los trabajadores informales a la economía formal.
Llegué aquí a Bogotá a trabajar en casas de familia interna desde la edad de 10 años. La situación y el desempleo pues me llevaron a trabajar en la calle.
Soy madre de 4 hijos, 3 hombres, 1 mujer. Todos somos recicladores.
Soy activista, defensora de derechos humanos y trabajo por los derechos de ciudadanos habitantes de calle y mujeres trabajadoras sexuales.
Soy partera tradicional y a la vez soy auxiliar de enfermería. Tengo experiencia de 30 años.
Yo soy mujer lideresa que siempre estamos al pie con las instituciones reclamando nuestros derechos.
Nosotros decidimos tomar como criterio para medir la informalidad en Colombia la afiliación o no y la cotización o no al sistema de salud y pensiones. Ahora bien, los trabajadores informales, si los entendemos como aquellos que no tienen la capacidad de contribuir a sus pensiones y al sistema de salud y por lo tanto están por fuera de ellos, son trabajadores especialmente vulnerables en todos los momentos, pero especialmente cuando se enfrentan a una pandemia como la que nos estamos enfrentando en este momento.
Compré este lote y lo dejamos aquí mucho tiempo quieto porque muy difícil construir. Llegué aquí construido solamente una pieza adelante.
Bueno, acá normalmente entre semana yo vengo solamente a hacer de comer y no voy para la bodega porque también salimos a reciclar. Tengo un sitio en el Porvenir y fuera de eso reciclamos en la calle. O sea, nosotros nos defendemos en muchas actividades.
Yo normalmente vendo esferos en las universidades y pues es una manera que pues yo sobrevivo pues para pagar arriendo, alimentación.
Estos discursos duales que separan o dividen los fenómenos socioeconómicos entre formales e informales anulan en gran medida la característica principal de ese tipo de economías. Estas economías por sí mismas son enormemente heterogéneas y son muy diversas. Cuando uno incluye en el solo cajón de la informalidad a todas estas expresiones de la economía, lo que hace es que anula toda la posibilidad de entendimiento de lo que pasa allí adentro.
Una teoría común dentro de la literatura económica es que la informalidad es de baja productividad y eso ha llevado a que se invisibilicen los aportes que hace en términos de crecimiento, en términos de generación de empleo. Es la principal fuente de empleo en el país y pues hay que reconocer que todas las personas que trabajan en el sector informal están pagando impuestos y están haciendo contribuciones al crecimiento a través de esas cadenas de valor. Entonces eso lo que está llevando es que el sector lo que llamamos el sector productivo en últimas esté siendo subsidiado de una manera por el trabajo informal.
Hace 2 años mi esposo quedó sin trabajo y a razón de que él se quedó sin trabajo, pues decidimos qué iba a hacer él. porque por la edad, por toda la situación, pues no es que consiga trabajo no tan fácil. Decidimos empeñar la casa, o sea, hipotecarla y comprar un camión. Estuvimos trabajando en un tiempo con Corbeta. Nos sentamos a analizar la situación de Corbeta y el trabajo. Un estafadero. Me retiré y empezamos a ir a Abastos a sacar mercados de abastos. Ya pues uno entra a Abastos, digamos, de la mañana y ya a las 10 de la mañana, 11 ya está usted desocupado. Ya uno a veces hacía carreos, una cosa, la otra, que un trasteo para alguna parte de la ciudad. Ahí estábamos sobreviviendo.
En Colombia, el derecho no tiene definiciones específicas de informalidad. Los trabajadores que no están vinculados con características de prestación personal, subordinación y remuneración se entienden excluidos del sistema de amparo laboral que reconoce el Código Sustantivo del Trabajo. No obstante ello, la Constitución promete la garantía de derechos para el trabajo en todas sus modalidades.
Hasta que el gobierno decidió que no, y que nosotros no teníamos derecho a trabajar. Solo los empresarios, los que tuvieran permiso y con permiso empresarial. De resto nada más. Y nosotros en ese momento no estábamos en ninguna empresa ni nada. Entonces, por eso fue que nosotros, al dejar el carro quieto sin hacer nada, si nosotros seguimos consumiendo, la casa sigue consumiendo, los servicios llegaban más caros en ese momento, no sabíamos ya qué hacer.
Pues en primer lugar, pues hay una consecuencia sobre la persecución de estas actividades como si todas ellas fueran en sí mismas ilegales y por lo tanto pues perseguibles. La segunda consecuencia es que hay un halo de estigmatización sobre lo que estas personas hacen, como que son aprovechadores del espacio público. La tercera consecuencia es que anulan su agencia y su capacidad, digamos, de sobreponerse a las situaciones.
Retomé, yo hacía mucho tiempo trabajar porcelanero, lo retomé, pues para trabajar desde la casa, pero eso fue un fracaso. No hay plata, decía la gente, no, es que no me alcanza, muy bonitos, pero no me alcanza. También he hecho tamales, hice empanadas, o sea, durante la pandemia he intentado miles de cosas.
COVID en Colombia ha crecido exponencialmente a partir de marzo hasta septiembre. En septiembre nos encontramos en el centro de la pandemia en el mundo al ser uno de los países que mayor cantidad de casos tiene, tanto en números absolutos como en números relativos por millón de habitantes. Los hallazgos más importantes en relación con la pandemia tienen que ver con la dificultad seria que tienen los hogares para seguir medidas de contención, de mitigación de la pandemia, como por ejemplo los aislamientos selectivos, los aislamientos generalizados y las cuarentenas, ya que los hogares con economías informales no tienen medios de soporte suficientes para responder a largas etapas sin laborar.
Cuando me di cuenta ya le debía como 6 cotas al carro, 6 cotas al carro. Cuando me di cuenta donde me guardan el carro también ya debía arriendo. No teníamos, estábamos viviendo el día a día y la situación y pues el ahorro era para pagar el carro, para así.
Esa primera cuarentena fue dura para el encierro. Mejor dicho, yo el gobierno, lo único que estamos es lo que nos dan del reciclador.
Lastimosamente el distrito y el gobierno nos dejaron abandonados a las poblaciones más vulnerables. A nosotros, Integración Social, nos llamó a varios líderes territoriales de diferentes lugares y nos dieron 50 mercados. Digamos, yo trabajo en el Santa Fe. En el Santa Fe hay más de 1000 mujeres trabajadoras sexuales. 50 mercados para el Santa Fe y un solo mercado cuando empezó. Y vamos para 5 meses y fue lo único que entregaron.
El gobierno colombiano ha hecho esfuerzos, sin embargo, estos esfuerzos frente a COVID han sido totalmente insuficientes comparados con países con productos internos brutos similares y con esquemas de seguridad social similares lo cual demuestra que las políticas públicas y el gobierno colombiano, en su estructura general y en su política pública particular frente a la pandemia, no han sido capaces de responder apropiadamente a este desafío.
Lo que sucedió fue que muchos colectivos, organizaciones o personas del común se pusieron la mano en el corazón y empezaron a crear campañas. Campañas para entregar mercados a vendedores ambulantes, campañas para apoyar a las mujeres trabajadoras sexuales, ayudándoles a pagar los 15 días de habitación, campañas para apoyar entregando mercados a las trabajadoras sexuales.
Ya va 7 meses que estoy acá. Y primero nos venimos acá por desplazamiento, usted sabe que con qué, con conflicto armado, de la minería, de venta ilegal de minería, todo eso. Y también nosotros trabajamos como artesanía para revender, para comprar cualquier cosita cuando no tenga comida. Usted sabe que algunas mujeres tienen 4 hijos, 5, 6 hijos y eso no alcanza. Esto vendía en centro y también hay veces los policías no les dejaban revender estos, hay veces casi nos quitaban.
Nosotros sobrevivimos en artesanía, pero no vendemos en la calle en este momento porque estamos acá en la toma. Hasta que el gobierno no cumple, no podemos salir de acá ni a revender ni salir para otro lado. Pero en la población es los más pobres, los son más vulnerables, no quieren mirar y queremos que miren, que le den una oportunidad para poder vivir en este ciudad Bogotá.
Nosotros proponemos que para entender las complejidades de la informalidad y de esta contribución que los trabajadores informales hacen a las economías de las naciones y al mantenimiento de las relaciones sociales, nosotros debemos emplear tanto elementos cuantitativos como cualitativos y de producción de nuevas políticas públicas que realmente atiendan las necesidades de los trabajadores informales. Es una reevaluación de la formalidad o de la pobreza extrema como los únicos mecanismos para acceso al sistema de seguridad social y de salud y para la prestación y el apoyo económico por parte del Estado.
Estamos retomando propuestas de muchos sectores. Tenemos que hacer una reforma laboral que reconozca que el trabajo informal es un auténtico trabajo y que por eso debe estar sujeto a protecciones estatales y que debe además buscarse que se sujete a las garantías del trabajo decente de acuerdo con las recomendaciones de la OIT. Necesitamos una reforma del sistema de seguridad social. Que sea solamente la formalidad el punto de acceso a la seguridad social, pues lleva a que los trabajadores informales estén desprovistos de protecciones para la vejez, para riesgos de enfermedad y para situaciones de crisis como a lo que nos está enfrentando la pandemia. Crear políticas efectivas y que tiene que partir de su autoidentificación y el reconocimiento de las precariedades a las que están expuestos. Reconocer y cuantificar los aportes que la economía informal hace a la economía nacional.
Entonces decidimos aguantar y ya vimos el momento en que ya empezaron a llamarnos del carro que nos lo iban a quitar, que no sé qué, que sí sé cuándo, que como esa amenazadera psicológica que empiezan ellos a tener con uno, ¿no? Nos tocó venderlo. Y eso es lo único que me ha dejado la pandemia, dolores de cabeza, deudas, y por uno pues querer hacer algo más, pero el gobierno limita mucho, lo limita uno demasiado. Dese cuenta si la gente no sale a pelear, dese cuenta si la gente no sale a pelear, dese cuenta si la gente no sale a pelear, dese cuenta si la gente no sale a pelear, dese cuenta si la gente no sale a pelear.
No tengo una respuesta. Escribo desde el caos, en plena oscuridad.
Al final empiezo donde terminé al comienzo, un puto bucle, un ciclo que es cada vez más intenso. Cada día trae su afán, pero el fin último es poner en la mesa agua y pan y listo. Salir de la rutina solo por imprevistos, creyéndome un idiota al sentirme listo. Me cago en todo pero no tengo otra opción, limpiarme el culo con mi lengua y ya pobre huevón. Qué estupidez, vivo como un autómata, no hay pajazo mental que haga mi vida cómoda. Pierdo mi lucidez, hago todo por inercia, mis necesidades con mi conciencia comercian. Todo es mecánico, no se puede pensar, entrar en pánico al no poder escapar, abrir la puerta para salir pero volver a entrar, pero volver a entrar, pero volver a entrar. Que gonorreañero me estoy deshaciendo, en un agujero negro me estoy convirtiendo. La luz de las estrellas a mi alrededor se extingue, me pulverizo lento como la gran esfinge. Estoy tratando de alargar este momento, comiendo lento, pensando rápido, respiro álgido, sé que está sucediendo, todo se repite justo antes de que me sienta plácido. Maldita sea, no es cuestión de perspectiva, mi historia es lo que viví, lo que sentí no es relativa, no, solo yo la veo de forma objetiva, así que su criterio arbitrario solo es gastar saliva. Yo y mis diatribas que en mi mente se repiten, aunque intente controlarlas no imiten, corriendo tras la luz pero al acercarme se aleja, de un puto bucle a ver cuál es la moraleja. Palpo mis rejas entre risas y quejas, incluso estando alegre mi mente no se despeja. Y no es tristeza ni depresión, evito el sufrimiento más no la resignación. Ya, mi fuerza sí son mis canciones, pero no es capaz de una prisión por meditar acciones. No, yo soy el vivo entre bribones, pero estoy más muerto que ellos por mis premeditaciones.
Arte Collective sharing this documentary that's going to be available soon in our webpage and in network so that you are able to see it, all the people who are interested and the ones that are interested there. So now we have a very short session now for questions, concerns, and logistics would be. I also want to express everyone to the panelists and all the people that we have done and all the people who have been here this morning, and once again, the financiers and strategic allies, Kent University, Essex University, Warwick University, and the Observatory of Equity of Women, UCESI in Colombia, the labor section of Rosario University, the research group in public health, and the alliance of Rosario University and the FE. So while we're waiting for the questions of this wonderful gathering, so Luis, please.
Enrique, espero que me escuchen bien.
Thank you very much, Enrique. I hope you can hear me well. I would like, I think we have not been able to thank very much certain people who have been crucial in all this work in all this month, especially the nature very much of all this moment and where we cannot gather face to face and to work really as a team in the same site, comfortable, all sharing a hefty cup of coffee. So the first person of all these people is really a collective, the collective Arte, Clara, Jesus, Johnny, and their team. They three accepted the challenge of building such a documentary that we just saw and to do this audiovisual ones in very difficult conditions, under difficult conditions. So thank you very much to them. And the continuous method of the Arte collective to give image and to have the plastic arts with grassroots people, not only in issues of informality and COVID, but also in the other projects that they have actually taken in the past few years. And also I would like to add some thanks to the experts in labor economics. They, in a very patient way, invited us to qualitatively social and juridical workers to accept the challenge and to understand the value of the quantitativeness, and they have been extremely patient with us. Thank you very much. And also I would like to thank to Angelica, so that she will be our anthropologist and the coordinator of the qualitative matter. And Angelica very patiently will actually help us and taught us to think more than one of two, three times. And to see all of their intervention. And Helica, initially in this moment of pandemic, she accepted the chance of being interviewing, interacting with the participants that actually are going to be some central figures of our life stories and the ones that you saw in the documentary. And finally, I would like to thank Andres, our assistant for research, who's actually helped us to keep our social networks alive and to be in contact with the participants in the project, and then with the institutions and the documents that actually come up with this project. And finally, Dora, our a graphic designer, and then we have there. And then we have the possibility. Please read the chat. There's an English question. and then you'll still find their digital platforms and so on. Thank you very much. The members of the collective, Neil, Tara, Celine, Donatella, Joanna, Enrique, and then not this the last project, but rather the beginning of much other collaborative work. Thank you very much, Luis. I don't know, Joanna, if you have to give some thought, and then we have for a question of Juan Rendon. Joanna, no, it's only one thing. It's actually to say thank you to Luis for all the work Luis Eslava did. It's been really a very hard worker. And then Luis is actually shown his hand for his commitment with the project, and great patience and so on. To there, so Luis, thank you very much. And actually ask you there for the support and all the work that you did of all the working team. Thank you very much to all for accompanying with it. And now we have theirs, and I would like to join to those thanks to Luis, who has been a leader and actually has patience for all of this. I'm going to change 1 minute to English.
So Juan Rendon asks, he first congratulates all for the event. He's at Cardiff University in Wales, and his question is the following. Have you considered researching the possibility of a break between the population more strongly affected by precarious needs and COVID-19 and mainstream political/economic institutions? He gives examples, for instance, banks, governments, and he says that some research has suggested a break between popular and upper classes during the Black Death. So perhaps, I don't know if Joanna, Luis, or any other participant, any other speaker would like to take on this question.
Can I quickly ask what the question means by break between popular and upper classes? I'm a bit uncertain.
Juan, I don't know if you could just clarify the question in the chat, please.
If anyone else has understood it, then go ahead.
Yeah, so you mean that part between popular and upper classes? I mean, perhaps he means between where this connection, such as the one that started to happen between peasants and upper class in the Middle Ages, working class, upper class, and how the so he means that those breaks between those different types of classes.
Maybe I can say something, but I would prefer to say it in Spanish. Oh, okay, I can. Sí, yo diría que es esa
I would say that it's that break, this accentuation between the gap of the popular classes and the richest classes, that this is a topic that we're beginning to see in the context of our research. Not only because with the pandemic and the economic crisis, you're having a greater inequity, a greater gap, but you're creating a sensation of the popular, of we are being abandoned by them. And it's that many of those informal workers of few incomes are the ones that actually had to put the face, the shoulder, to take the most strict confinement. There was the sensation that they had to do it, assuming and internalizing all the risks, because as we've been speaking here, they're actually stripped away from health, from work, from social security in general. So I think that we have not explored it in depth, but this is the issue here of this is something that we can include in our research. And as a matter of fact, our research is giving us some guidelines as to how we can reorganize a new class struggles. Thank you very much, Joanna. And before Juan actually thanks you for that answer, I don't know if anyone, Celine or Neil, do you want to compliment it once you understood what this break means? Neil, would you like to take the mic?
Go ahead, Luis. Go ahead, and then I can comment later.
Sigue tú primero, Luis, y después yo voy.
recalcar lo que acaba de decir Joan.
I just wish to highlight what Joan just said in the sense of accentuating the differences with the ones that I did in the documentary, and all of my colleagues that actually shared some of the data that we were managed to capture and so in our research. So it is important to highlight that this is data that ever more are getting worse. The gap is getting worse as pandemia passes, is getting worse, and the national economies are getting worse. So we are suffering more the impact, even more accentuated, of this crisis.
Para personas que ya venían de una
Then we
situación.
have their vulnerable situation. He's breaking up. That is very worrisome for families as well as, but collectively this is going to have effects politically there. And we know what these effects are. And there's some social tensions, not only here, various, there with the effects of violence, they're all too clear. And if this were to continue and the pandemic continues, if we do not have a vaccine soon, or if we don't have some mechanisms to redistribute wealth and help us collectively, well, what we're going to view there is he's breaking up. An array of tensions between classes, the masses, and the elite. The language that we have there, where the ultra-precariousness is becoming a generalized affair. Anil, or thank you very much, Luis. Anil, perhaps if you wish to mention something additional, and then we have to comment. Then we have about the question of.
Hi, I think I lost some of the discussion for a moment there. But no, yeah, I agree with Johanna and Luis's comments, and this is important, and we can clearly see how this amplified the precariousness of informal workers, COVID-19. One thing that, just as an addition, that I noticed looking at the results of the project is one that many informal workers have high levels of debt, and this pandemic has pushed them towards even accruing even more debt, which is really problematic. And the other thing that is not necessarily based on research, but my observation is that there is a hostility among upper classes, and that's something that was mentioned in the documentary as well, towards informal workers for various reasons. So I think indeed there can be definitely more research in this area.